A lavish Christmas gala, 200 witnesses, and one moment that would destroy a billionaire's perfect lie. Madison Brooks thought she knew what fear looked like. 3 years of hiding bruises, of silent survival, of recording evidence she prayed she'd never need. But when her husband's foot connected with her pregnant belly in front of flashing cameras, everything shattered. What happened next? A father in a Santa suit, a betrayal no one saw coming, and a fight for justice that would expose secrets worth $500 million. This is a story about power, survival, and the dangerous cost of speaking truth. Before we begin, if stories like this matter to you, hit that like button and subscribe. Your support helps us share stories that need to be heard. Now, let's dive in. Madison Brooks stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her fingers trembling as she dabbed concealer over the purple bruise along her jawline. 7 months pregnant, and she'd become an expert at color correction, foundation, powder, a careful blend that transformed evidence into invisibility. Behind her, Derek Kavanaugh leaned against the doorframe of their penthouse bathroom, watching, always watching. "You're taking too long," he said, his voice carrying that dangerous calm she'd learned to fear more than his rage. "We need to leave in 20 minutes. "Almost done," Madison whispered, keeping her eyes on the mirror. Never make eye contact when he's in this mood. She'd been an investigative journalist once, won a regional award at 26 for exposing a corrupt city council member. That was before Derek, before she'd traded her career for what she thought was love, then traded her freedom for what she knew was survival. Her phone sat on the marble counter, recording app hidden 3 screens deep. 6 months of conversations, carefully documented. 6 months of building a case she wasn't sure she'd ever be brave enough to use. "The Christmas gala tonight," Derek continued, adjusting his Rolex. "Everyone who matters will be there. Senator Williams, the Ashford family, all my investors. You'll smile. You'll play the grateful wife. You'll make me look good." Madison nodded, applying lipstick with a steady hand she didn't feel. The baby kicked against her ribs, as if reminding her why she couldn't leave. Where would she go? Derek had systematically isolated her from every friend, every colleague, every lifeline. Even her father Harrison hadn't spoken to her in 3 years, not since she'd chosen Derek over his warnings. "I need you to understand something," Derek said, stepping closer. His cologne, expensive and suffocating, filled the small space. "Tonight is about the Riverside development deal. $400 million. My entire reputation's on the line. So whatever you're thinking, whatever little rebellion is forming in that head of yours, forget it." He gripped her wrist, not hard enough to leave marks, never hard enough to leave marks where people could see. "Do you understand me?" "Madison." "I understand," she said softly. He released her and walked away. Madison exhaled slowly, her hand moving to her belly. The baby kicked again, stronger this time. She finished her makeup, then slipped the phone into her clutch. Tonight, Derek would give his annual speech at the Waldorf Astoria Christmas Gala. Tonight, she'd plant the recording device in his jacket pocket during the cocktail hour, just like she'd practiced. Tonight, she told herself, she'd gather the final piece of evidence she needed. What Madison didn't know was that tonight, everything would shatter far beyond anything she could plan for. Tonight, the careful prison she'd built around her survival would explode in front of 200 witnesses and a dozen cameras. And the man in the Santa suit walking through the hotel's service entrance at that very moment would change everything. The Waldorf Astoria ballroom glittered like a jewelry box, crystal chandeliers casting diamonds of light across the marble floor. Women in designer gowns air-kissed. Men in tuxedos discussed stock portfolios over champagne. And a string quartet played Silent Night with professional precision. Madison stood near the towering Christmas tree, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other clutching sparkling water someone had assumed was champagne. Her sky blue gown had cost $8,000. Derek had chosen it. Across the room, Derek held court with a circle of investors, his laughter echoing with practiced charm. Next to him stood Sloane Hartley, his assistant, 29, sharp as a blade in her crimson dress, wearing a diamond necklace Madison recognized immediately. The necklace Derek said he'd returned last month. Too expensive, he'd claimed. Not appropriate for the budget. Madison's stomach twisted. She'd suspected for months, but suspicion and proof were different countries. Mrs. Kavanaugh, a voice interrupted her thoughts. Sloane had materialized beside her with the wine glass in hand. You look absolutely radiant. Pregnancy suits you. The words dripped with false sweetness. Madison forced a smile. Thank you. Such a shame about your journalism career. Sloane continued, taking a slow sip of wine. Derek mentioned you used to be quite ambitious. Before, settling down. Before he made me quit. Before he convinced me my career was damaging his reputation. Before he isolated me so completely that ambition felt like a foreign language. I'm focusing on family now, Madison said. The script Derek had written for her. Sloane's smile sharpened. Of course. Oh, how clumsy of me. She tilted her wine glass, sending deep red liquid cascading down Madison's dress. Madison gasped, stepping back. The cold wetness spread across the silk, staining it like blood. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Sloane's voice carried across nearby conversations, drawing eyes. How terribly clumsy. Derek, your poor wife. Derek appeared instantly, his face a mask of concern for the audience, but his eyes, when they met Madison's, were ice. Sloane, get some club soda. Madison, come with me. He gripped her elbow, fingers digging in as he steered her toward a private alcove behind the stage, away from witnesses. What did you say to her? He hissed. Nothing. She spilled it on purpose. Derek, she's wearing the necklace you said you returned, the one you're having an affair with her. His hand moved so fast she didn't see it coming. Not a slap, never where it showed. His fingers closed around her wrist, twisting until pain shot up her arm. You're being paranoid, he said quietly. Hormonal, imagining things that aren't there. Do you know how embarrassing you are right now? I'm not imagining anything, Madison said, and something in her voice was different, harder. The journalist who'd once confronted corrupt politicians flickered back to life. I know what you're doing. I know about Sloane, and I'm done pretending. Derek's expression shifted. For a moment, genuine surprise crossed his face. Then something darker. You're done. You don't get to be done. Madison, you're my wife. You're carrying my child. You're mine. I'm leaving. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. After the baby comes, I'm taking him and I'm leaving you. The ballroom noise faded to a distant hum. They stood in their private alcove, the massive Christmas tree visible through the gap in the curtains. 200 oblivious guests beyond. Derek laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Leave with what money, what support system? I've spent 3 years making sure you have nothing and no one. You think you can just walk away? I'll find a way. No, he said simply. You won't. Then he shoved her. Hard. Madison stumbled backward, her pregnant belly throwing off her balance. She crashed into the Christmas tree, the 15-foot evergreen tilting as ornaments exploded around her. Glass shattered on marble. Someone screamed, and Derek, his face twisted with rage, drew his foot back and kicked her in the stomach. The pain was white-hot, blinding. Madison's world tilted as she fell, her arms instinctively wrapping around her belly, around her baby. The floor rushed up to meet her, and she heard the crack of her head against marble. Voices erupted. Footsteps thundered. Camera flashes exploded like lightning. Through blurring vision, Madison saw Derek standing over her, his fist clenched. No remorse on his face. Only cold calculation as he turned to the gathering crowd. She slipped, he announced, his voice steady. The pregnancy has made her unsteady. Everyone saw. She lost her balance. Madison tried to speak, but pain swallowed her words. Her dress, already stained with wine, now felt wet with something else. Something warm. Blood. The baby. Oh God, the baby. Someone call an ambulance, a woman shouted. Madison's vision darkened at the edges. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness claimed her was the Christmas tree, half fallen, its shattered ornaments glittering like broken promises across the ballroom floor. And somewhere far away, the grand entrance doors burst open with a blast of December wind. Harrison Brooks hadn't worn a Santa suit since Madison was 7 years old. That was 21 years ago, before his tech company became a billion-dollar empire, before his daughter grew up and stopped believing in fairy tales, before she married a monster and cut him out of her life. But tonight, arriving at the Waldorf Astoria for what was supposed to be a surprise reconciliation, he heard the screams before he even removed the fake beard. Hotel security tried to stop him. "Sir, you can't just—" Harrison pushed past them, his 62-year-old body moving with adrenaline-fueled strength. The ballroom doors stood open. A crowd gathered in horrified silence around something on the floor. Around someone. He shoved through the mass of designer gowns and tuxedos, and his heart stopped. Madison lay crumpled beneath a half-fallen Christmas tree, her sky-blue dress soaked dark with wine and blood. Her arms were wrapped around her pregnant belly. Her eyes were closed. "Maddie," he choked out, dropping to his knees beside her. Glass ornaments cut through the Santa suit, but he didn't feel it. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" A man in a tuxedo, handsome in that calculated way Harrison immediately distrusted, stepped forward. "I'm her husband, Derek Kavanaugh." She fell. The pregnancy made her dizzy. Harrison looked up at him, then around the ballroom, at the toppled Christmas tree, at the pattern of shattered ornaments leading from Madison's body, at the crowd of witnesses whose faces told a different story than Derek's calm words. "She didn't fall," Harrison said quietly. "Someone needs to call the police. Now." "Already called an ambulance," a woman in the crowd said. "They're 3 minutes out." Harrison turned back to Madison, his hand trembling as he touched her face. "Stay with me, baby girl. Stay with me." Her eyelids fluttered. "Dad," her voice was barely a whisper. "The baby's not moving." Those 4 words broke something in Harrison that 3 years of silence couldn't repair. "The baby's going to be fine. You're both going to be fine. I'm here now. I'm so sorry I wasn't here before." Sirens wailed outside. Paramedics burst through the doors with organized efficiency, equipment rattling as they surrounded Madison. Harrison stepped back, watching them work with professional precision: blood pressure cuff, IV line, oxygen mask. "Fetal heartbeat is weak," one paramedic said quietly to another. "We need to move now." They loaded Madison onto a stretcher. As they wheeled her toward the exit, she reached out, her hand finding Harrison's. "He planned this," she whispered. "It's all recorded." Then she was gone, disappearing into the ambulance with flashing lights painting the snow red and blue. Harrison stood in the ballroom entrance, still wearing the ridiculous Santa suit, watching the ambulance speed away. Behind him, Derek Kavanaugh was surrounded by well-dressed people offering sympathy, already spinning the narrative in his favor. Harrison pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. It rang twice. "Victor Ashford's office," a receptionist answered. "Tell Victor that Harrison Brooks needs his best attorney. Not for me, for my daughter. And tell him to bring a criminal defense specialist too, because whatever happened here tonight, I'm going to make sure someone pays for it." He hung up and turned back to the ballroom. Derek was giving a statement to hotel security, his face a mask of concerned husband. Sloane Hartley stood beside him, one hand on his arm, her crimson dress catching the light. Harrison walked directly to them, his Santa boots squeaking slightly on the marble. Ridiculous. He looked absolutely ridiculous. But he'd never felt more dangerous in his life. "Derek Kavanaugh," he said quietly. Derek turned, eyebrows raised. "Mr. Brooks, I'm so sorry about Madison. The pregnancy has been difficult." "My daughter told me you planned this," Harrison said, keeping his voice low. "I don't know what that means yet, but I promise you, I'm going to find out. And when I do, you're going to wish you'd never met the Brooks family." Derek's expression didn't change. "Sir, you're clearly upset. Your daughter had an accident. I love her very much. I'm worried about her mental state." "Her mental state," Harrison repeated. Interesting choice of words. He stepped closer, close enough that only Derek could hear his next words. "I built a company from nothing. I've destroyed competitors, bought out enemies, and bankrupted people who underestimated me. You think your $400 million development deal makes you powerful? I could end your career with 3 phone calls. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay away from my daughter, and I'm going to find out exactly what you did to her." Derek smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Brooks, I understand you're protective, but Madison is my wife. Legally, medically, financially. You haven't spoken to her in 3 years. I've been there for her. I'll continue to be there for her." And if you try to interfere in my marriage, I have lawyers who specialize in restraining orders against difficult family members. Harrison stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away, his Santa suit trailing red velvet across the marble floor. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft flakes illuminating in the streetlights. Harrison stood on the sidewalk, pulling off the fake beard, breathing hard. His phone rang. The hospital. "Mr. Brooks, this is Cedar-Sinai Medical Center. Your daughter is in emergency surgery. The baby's in distress. You should come now." Harrison ran for his car. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and fear. Harrison paced the surgical waiting room, his Santa suit now crumpled in a plastic bag, wearing scrubs a sympathetic nurse had found for him. His wife Beth was on her way from their Connecticut estate, her voice breaking over the phone when he'd called with the news. 3 years. 3 years since he'd seen his only daughter, all because of one argument about Derek Kavanaugh. Harrison had run a background check before the wedding, found nothing concrete but enough red flags to make him nervous. A first wife who died under suspicious circumstances, ruled a suicide but never fully investigated. Business deals that skirted legal boundaries. A charm that felt manufactured. Madison had been furious when he'd presented his concerns, called him controlling, said he couldn't accept that she was an adult making her own choices. She'd married Derek anyway, in a small ceremony Harrison hadn't been invited to. And then, slowly, she'd disappeared, quit her journalism job, stopped returning calls, the few times Beth had managed to reach her. Madison sounded distant, rehearsed, like someone reading from a script. Mr. Brooks, a doctor in surgical scrubs, approached, her face professionally neutral. "I'm Dr. Rachel Palmer. I've been overseeing your daughter's emergency procedure." Harrison's heart hammered. "Is she alive? Is the baby alive?" "Your daughter is stable, the baby, however, is in critical condition. We've managed to stop the hemorrhaging, but the trauma to Mrs. Kavanaugh's abdomen was severe. The fetus is showing signs of distress. We're monitoring continuously, but the next 72 hours are crucial. Can I see her, Sean?" "She's in recovery, sedated. She'll be moved to a private room within the hour." Dr. Palmer paused. "Mr. Brooks, I need to ask. The injuries your daughter sustained, they're consistent with blunt force trauma, not a fall. Someone needs to file a police report." "I'll take care of it," Harrison said. The doctor nodded and walked away. Harrison sank into a plastic chair, his head in his hands. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Brooks, this is Victor Ashford. My team is en route. Don't let Madison speak to anyone without counsel present. Derek Kavanaugh has already retained Pearson Associates. They're the best defense firm in the state." Defense firm for the victim's husband. The implication was clear. Another text, this one from Beth. "Landing in 20 minutes. Hold on, Harrison. We'll fix this. But how do you fix something this broken? How do you protect someone who'd pushed you away, then ended up exactly where you'd feared she would?" The waiting room TV played local news on mute. Harrison glanced up and froze. Derek Kavanaugh filled the screen, standing outside the Waldorf Astoria, snow falling gently around his shoulders. The chyron read, "Billionaire's wife hospitalized after Christmas gala incident." Harrison grabbed the remote and turned up the volume. "Tonight, my wife Madison experienced a tragic accident." Derek was saying, his expression perfectly calibrated between concern and strength. "She's been under tremendous stress with the pregnancy. I'm asking for privacy during this difficult time as we focus on her recovery and our unborn child's health." The reporter, a young woman with aggressive ambition in her eyes, pressed forward. "Mr. Kavanaugh, witnesses say they saw you arguing with your wife before she fell. Can you comment on that?" "Absolutely not true," Derek said smoothly. "Madison and I were having a wonderful evening until she became dizzy. Pregnancy can cause balance issues. As any doctor will tell you, I'm just grateful she's receiving excellent care." Another reporter shouted, "Is it true her father, Harrison Brooks, threatened you?" Derek's expression shifted to something resembling sadness. "Mr. Brooks and Madison have had a strained relationship for years. I understand he's upset, but I hope everyone can focus on what matters, which is Madison and the baby's well-being, not speculation or family drama." The screen cut back to the studio, where anchors began discussing the incident with legal analysts and medical experts. All of them, Harrison noticed, were framing it as an accident, a tragic mishap, the natural result of a difficult pregnancy and an unfortunate fall. None of them mentioned the kick, the deliberate violence, the witnesses who'd seen exactly what happened. Derek was already controlling the narrative. "Mr. Brooks," a nurse appeared. "Your daughter is awake. She's asking for you." Harrison followed her through sterile hallways to a private room at the end of the corridor. Beth was already there, having somehow arrived while he was watching the news. She sat beside Madison's bed, holding their daughter's hand, tears streaming down her face. Madison looked small in the hospital bed, dwarfed by machines and monitors. An IV dripped fluids into her arm. A fetal monitor beeped steadily beside her, the baby's heartbeat visible as a green line on the screen. "Maddie," Harrison whispered, approaching slowly. "Sweetheart." She turned her head toward him, and the look in her eyes broke him. Exhaustion, pain, but also something else, something harder. "He's going to say I'm crazy," she said, her voice hoarse. "He's already started. Hasn't he? I saw the news. He's going to make everyone believe this was my fault." "No," Harrison said firmly. "We have witnesses. We have the truth." Madison laughed, a bitter sound. "You think that matters? Derek has connections everywhere. Judges, politicians, media outlets. He's been building his protection for years." She gripped her mother's hand tighter. "I recorded conversations. 6 months of evidence on my phone, but my phone is back at the penthouse, in a safe. Only Derek knows the combination to." "Then we'll get a warrant," Harrison said. "We'll force him to produce it." "On what grounds?" Madison's eyes were too knowing, too experienced in the ways powerful men protect themselves. "I'm his wife. That's his property. His home. His lawyers will tie it up for months. And by then, he'll have destroyed everything." The fetal monitor beeped steadily, the only sound in the heavy silence. "There's something else," Madison said quietly. "Derek's first wife, Sarah, she died 5 years ago, ruled a suicide. But right before we got married, I found her journal in a storage unit Derek thought he'd cleaned out. She wrote about how he isolated her, controlled her, hurt her. The last entry was 2 days before she died. She said she was going to leave him." Harrison felt ice in his veins. "Where's the journal now?" "I hid it, in a safety deposit box under my maiden name. I was saving it, in case I ever needed leverage." Madison's voice broke. "I thought I was being smart, protecting myself, but I waited too long. And now he's going to take my baby." "No," Beth said fiercely. "No, he's not. We'll fight him. We'll—" The door opened. A man in an expensive suit walked in, followed by 2 associates carrying briefcases. "Madison Cavanaugh," the man said. "I'm Gerald Pierce, representing your husband Derek. I'm here to serve you with emergency custody papers. Given your unstable mental state and the danger you pose to your unborn child, Mr. Cavanaugh is seeking immediate temporary custody upon the child's birth, pending psychiatric evaluation of the mother." He placed papers on the rolling table beside Madison's bed. Harrison moved to block him, but Pierce simply smiled. "Mr. Brooks, I understand your paternal instincts, but this is a legal matter between husband and wife. I'd advise you not to interfere, or we'll be forced to file a restraining order." Madison stared at the papers, her face draining of color. "He can't do this." "He can, and he is," Pierce said. "We have 3 witnesses who will testify to your erratic behavior tonight. Dr. Palmer's report notes you were admitted with high stress hormones and signs of a panic disorder. Combined with your estrangement from your family and lack of support system, the court will see a clear pattern of instability." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Mrs. Cavanaugh, your husband loves you. He's doing this to protect your child. If you cooperate with the psychiatric evaluation and treatment he's arranging, this can all be resolved amicably. Fight him, and you'll lose everything." The door closed behind him. Madison stared at the ceiling, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The fetal monitor's beeping accelerated. "Mrs. Cavanaugh, you need to calm down," a nurse said, appearing suddenly. "Your blood pressure is spiking. This isn't good for the baby." "Calm down," Madison's voice rose. "He's taking my child. How am I supposed to—" Madison, breathe, Beth commanded, using her therapist voice. Slow breaths, in through your nose, out through your mouth. But Madison couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. The walls were closing in. Everything she'd feared. Everything she'd tried to prevent by staying silent, by documenting evidence, by waiting for the perfect moment to escape, was happening when into him. Derek had outmaneuvered her. He'd turned her victimhood into proof of her unfitness. He'd made her trauma evidence of her instability. She'd lost before the fight even began. The nurse injected something into her IV. This will help you rest, she said gently. You need to sleep for the baby's sake. Madison's vision blurred. The last thing she heard before the medication pulled her under was her father's voice, low and fierce. I'm going to destroy him. Maddie, I swear to God, I'm going to destroy him. But even through the fog of sedation, Madison knew the truth. Her father's money couldn't save her. His connections couldn't protect her. Derek had spent 3 years building a perfect cage, and now that she'd tried to escape, he was simply making the bars visible. The baby kicked weakly, a flutter against her hand, and Madison sank into darkness, wondering if she'd still be a mother when she woke up. Madison woke to the sound of monitors beeping and hushed voices outside her door. The hospital room was dark except for the glow of machines and the faint light from the hallway. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and her hand immediately went to her belly. The baby moved, small, but there, still alive. She exhaled, tears sliding down her temples into her hair. 72 hours. The doctor had said. They'd made it through 12 so far. Her phone vibrated on the bedside table. Not her phone, she realized. Looking closer, a cheap burner phone that definitely hadn't been there when she'd fallen asleep. Madison glanced at the door, then picked up the device. One message from an unknown number. Don't trust your father's lawyers. Derek owns them. I have proof he planned this. Meet me. Her pulse quickened. A trap definitely possible. Derek could be testing her, documenting her paranoia for his custody case. But what if it wasn't? She typed back with trembling fingers. Who is this? The response came immediately. Someone who's been investigating Derek for 2 years. Check under your pillow. Madison's heart hammered as she reached beneath the thin hospital pillow. Her fingers found a flash drive. Another message. Everything you need is on there. Offshore accounts, money laundering, pension fund theft, $470 million stolen from working families. I'm FBI forensic accounting. I've been building a case, but I need your help to finish it. FBI, this could be real, or it could be an elaborate setup. Madison made a decision. She plugged the flash drive into the hospital room's computer, the one patients use for entertainment. The screen filled with spreadsheets, bank statements, wire transfer records, months of financial data, meticulously documented. She'd been an investigative journalist. She knew how to read financial crimes. This was real. Her phone buzzed again. The parking garage. Level 3, Section B, 20 minutes. Come alone. If you bring anyone, I disappear, and so does the evidence. Madison looked at her IV, the fetal monitor, the nurse's station visible through her door window. She was supposed to be on bed rest. Leaving would be medically dangerous and legally stupid. She pulled the IV out of her arm. The bathroom had a small window leading to a maintenance corridor. Madison had noticed it earlier. The journalist in her always cataloging exits. She'd lost that instinct during her marriage. The constant hypervigilance Derek demanded replacing her natural investigative awareness. She was getting it back now. Moving carefully, one hand supporting her belly. Madison squeezed through the window. The maintenance corridor was narrow and dimly lit, the kind of space cleaning crews used. She followed it to a service elevator, praying her hospital gown and slippers wouldn't attract attention. The parking garage was cold and echoing. Madison's breath fogged in the December air as she made her way to Level 3, Section B. Her body screamed at her to stop, to go back to bed, to think about the baby. But if Derek took custody, none of that would matter. A figure stepped from behind a concrete pillar, female, around Madison's age, wearing jeans and a FBI windbreaker. Familiar in a way that made Madison's breath catch. Paige, Madison whispered. Paige Sullivan. Her college roommate stepped into the fluorescent light, looking older but unmistakable. Hey, Mads, long time. You're FBI, forensic accountant, I've been tracking Derek's company for 18 months, fraud division. When I realized you were married to him, I tried to reach out, but your number was disconnected. Your email bounced. You'd completely disappeared. Paige's expression was tight with concern. I've been watching you from a distance, waiting for the right moment. Tonight, when I saw the news, I knew I had to move. Madison leaned against a car, her legs suddenly weak. You've been investigating him by him. His whole operation, Riverside Development, is a shell company. MADS, they take pension funds, invest them in fake properties, launder the money through offshore accounts, and leave working families with nothing. Derek's stolen almost $500 million over 5 years. But he's careful. Everything's hidden behind layers of legitimate business. The flash drive, 2 years of evidence, but I can't use it officially. I got it through questionable means. A good defense attorney, which Derek definitely has, would get it thrown out. That's why I need you. Madison's mind raced. What do you need from me? Derek trusts you to a point. You've been in his office, his home. You said you have recordings. At Madison's nod, Paige continued. If we can combine your evidence with mine, if we can show a pattern of behavior alongside the financial crimes, we can build a case that sticks. But we need to move back tomorrow morning. Derek's filing an emergency psychiatric hold. He's already got a judge lined up who owes him favors. Once that goes through, anything you say will be dismissed as delusion. A psychiatric hold. Madison's voice came out small. He can do that. With the right doctor and the right judge. Yeah. Paige's expression was grim. I've seen him do it before. Not directly. But there are patterns. Women who threatened his business. A journalist who was investigating him last year. She ended up in a private facility for evaluation. By the time she was released, her credibility was destroyed. The parking garage seemed to tilt. Madison gripped the car harder. What do I do? First, we get you back to your room before anyone notices. Second, tomorrow when your father's lawyer shows up, you tell them you want Camille Ross. She's a prosecutor. Worked with my division before. She's clean, she's ruthless, and she hates abusers. Your father's lawyers are corporate types. They'll try to negotiate with Derek. Ross will go for his throat. And the recordings, they're in Derek's safe. Paige smiled, a hard expression. Leave that to me. I've got a friend in the digital forensics unit. If those recordings exist, we'll find them. A car door slammed somewhere in the garage. Both women tensed. Go, Paige said. I'll contact you on the burner phone. Don't trust anyone else. Mads, Derek has people everywhere, even in your father's company. Madison turned toward the elevator, then looked back. Paige, why are you helping me? We haven't spoken in 8 years. Paige's expression softened. Because you were the person who taught me to stand up for myself when we were 20. You wrote that article exposing the guy who was drugging girls at campus parties. Remember, you could have been expelled for going against the administration. But you did it anyway. You saved lives. Mads, now I'm returning the favor. Madison felt tears burn her eyes. That article, that version of herself felt like another person. Someone brave and certain. When had she lost that? She made it back to her room just as a nurse was checking her vitals. Mrs. Kavanaugh, you pulled out your IV. I needed the bathroom, Madison said, climbing back into bed. I didn't want to bother anyone. The nurse reinserted the line with professional efficiency. You need to rest. The baby's heartbeat is stronger, but you're not out of danger yet. After the nurse left, Madison lay in the dark, one hand on her belly, the other clutching the burner phone. For the first time since the gala, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope, and she felt like herself again. Madison woke to voices arguing outside her room. Her father's voice, raised in anger. A woman's voice she didn't recognize, calm but firm. And underneath it all, a voice that made her blood run cold. Derek. She sat up too fast, pain shooting through her abdomen. The fetal monitor's beeping accelerated. The door opened. Derek walked in first, wearing a charcoal suit and an expression of manufactured concern. Behind him came two people in white coats and a man Madison recognized from last night, Gerald Pierce, Derek's attorney. Madison, Derek said gently, how are you feeling? Get out, she said. Sweetheart, I know you're upset, but I'm here to help you. He turned to the doctors. As you can see, she's highly agitated. This is exactly the behavior I've been concerned about. What is this? Madison demanded. Pierce stepped forward. Mrs. Gibbonaugh, these doctors are here to evaluate your mental state. Given the severity of last night's incident and your clear distress, we're implementing an emergency psychiatric assessment. For your safety and your baby's, I don't consent. You don't have to, Pierce said smoothly. Your husband, as your next of kin and the father of your child, has authorized this evaluation. It's a standards procedure in cases involving potential harm to self or others. The door burst open again. Harrison strode in, followed by a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes like a hawk. This evaluation is over, the woman announced. I'm Camille Ross, and as of 10 minutes ago, I'm Mrs. Kavanaugh's legal counsel. No psychiatric assessment will occur without my presence and approval. Pierce's expression didn't change. Ms. Ross, while I respect your involvement, this is a family matter. Mr. Kavanaugh has every right. Mr. Kavanaugh has the right to remain silent, which I suggest he exercise immediately. Ross interrupted. She pulled papers from her briefcase. I'm filing for an emergency restraining order against Derek Kavanaugh, citing credible threats to my client's safety. Until that hearing, which will occur this afternoon, he's not to be within 500 feet of Mrs. Kavanaugh. Derek's mask slipped for just a moment. Madison saw the flash of rage before he controlled it. You're making a mistake. Madison, I'm trying to protect you. The only person she needs protection from is you, Harrison said. Get out, now. For a long moment, no one moved. The hospital room felt explosive, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Then Pierce touched Derek's arm. We should go. Let the legal process work. They left, but Derek's parting look at Madison was pure ice. She'd seen that look before, right before he'd kicked her. As soon as the door closed, Madison sagged against the pillows. How did you know to call her? She asked her father. I didn't, Harrison admitted. She called me, said someone from the FBI had contacted her. Paige, of course. Ross sat down in the chair beside Madison's bed. Mrs. Kavanaugh, we don't have much time. Your husband has filed for emergency custody, claiming you're a danger to your unborn child. The hearing is in 6 hours. I need to know everything, no matter how small, no matter how embarrassing. Everything. Madison took a breath. I have recordings, 6 months of conversations. He's been abusing me for 2 years, isolating me, controlling every aspect of my life. Last night, I told him I was leaving. That's when he kicked me. Where are these recordings? On my phone, in a safe at his penthouse. Only he knows the combination. Ross made a note. We'll need a warrant. That'll take time we don't have. What else? His first wife, Sarah Kavanaugh, she died 5 years ago, ruled a suicide, but I found her journal. She documented the same pattern of abuse. The last entry was 2 days before she died. Ross's pen paused. Where's this journal? Safety deposit box. First National Bank. Under my maiden name, Brooks. Good. That's accessible. Ross leaned forward. Madison, I need you to understand what we're up against. Your husband is a billionaire with connections throughout the judicial system. The judge hearing your custody case this afternoon, Judge Richard Morrison, plays golf with Derek's attorney. This isn't going to be fair, but we're going to fight anyway. What are my chances? Ross didn't sugarcoat it. Without solid evidence, 20%, maybe less. Derek's team has already painted you as unstable. They have witnesses who will testify you were acting erratically at the gala. They have medical records showing high stress hormones. And they have the fact that you haven't seen your own parents in 3 years, which they'll use to show you're isolated and paranoid. So we can't win. I didn't say that. I said it won't be fair. There's a difference. Ross stood. Now, I need to speak with your friend, Paige Sullivan. She's waiting downstairs with evidence that could change everything. But Madison, you need to prepare yourself. This is going to get ugly. Derek's going to attack your character, your mental health, your fitness as a mother. Can you handle that? Madison looked down at her belly. where her baby was still fighting to survive. Thought about Sarah Kavanaugh's journal, about all the women Derek had hurt. I was an investigative journalist, she said quietly. I exposed a city council member who was embezzling funds. I wrote about a pharmaceutical company covering up dangerous side effects. I interviewed victims of human trafficking. I'm not afraid of ugly. Ross smiled, a fierce expression. Good, because we're about to make Derek Kavanaugh very uncomfortable. After Ross left, Madison was alone with her parents. Beth sat on the bed, holding her daughter's hand. Harrison stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot where Derek's Mercedes was pulling away. I'm sorry, Panta, Madison said, for everything, for shutting you out, for not listening. You were right about him. Don't, Harrison said. Turning around, Jen, don't apologize for surviving. You did what you had to do by him. Now we fight back. The burner phone buzzed. A text from Paige. Bad news. Derek's people got to the safe first. Recordings are gone. But we have backup plan. Trust me. Madison's hope crumbled. The recordings are gone. Derek destroyed them. Then we find another way, Beth said firmly. You're not alone anymore, sweetheart. Whatever happens, you are not alone. But as Madison lay in that hospital bed, watching her parents try to project confidence they clearly didn't feel, she understood the truth. Derek had won this round. He'd systematically destroyed her evidence, isolated her from support, and positioned himself as a concerned husband dealing with an unstable wife. The custody hearing was in 6 hours, and Madison had nothing left to fight with except her word against his, which she'd learned over 3 years of marriage had never been enough. The custody hearing took place in a courthouse conference room, not a courtroom, more intimate, Judge Morrison had said, less stressful for everyone involved. But Madison knew the real reason: fewer witnesses to what was about to happen. She sat between Camille Ross and her father, her hospital gown replaced by a conservative dress Beth had brought. Every movement hurt. The baby kicked occasionally, reminding her what she was fighting for. Across the table, Derek looked perfect. Concerned husband, pressed suit, expensive leather portfolio. His attorney, Gerald Pierce, radiated confidence. Behind them sat 3 witnesses: Derek's business partner, his executive assistant, and the event planner from the gala. Judge Morrison was 60, balding, with the soft look of someone who'd spent decades making compromises. Before we begin, he said, I want to emphasize this is a preliminary hearing. We're here to determine if emergency measures are necessary to protect the unborn child. Mrs. Kavanaugh, you understand that? Yes, Your Honor, well, Madison said. Good, Mr. Pierce, proceed. Pierce stood, his movements rehearsed. Your Honor, we're here because my client's wife is suffering from severe prenatal psychiatric distress. The incident at the Christmas gala was not, as Mrs. Kavanaugh claims, an assault. It was the tragic result of her deteriorating mental state. We have witnesses who will testify to her erratic behavior, her paranoid accusations, and her physical instability. Furthermore, Mrs. Kavanaugh has been estranged from her family for 3 years, showing a pattern of isolation and possible personality disorder. My client loves his wife. He wants to help her. But first and foremost, he must protect their unborn child. Ross stood. Your Honor, that's an interesting narrative. Here's another one. Derek Kavanaugh is a violent abuser who kicked his pregnant wife in front of 200 witnesses, sending her to the hospital with severe trauma. This emergency custody is his attempt to control the narrative and intimidate his victim into silence. Ms. Ross, Judge Morrison said tiredly, do you have evidence of abuse? We have the medical reports showing blunt force trauma inconsistent with a fall. Medical reports can be interpreted many ways. Do you have witnesses to actual violence? Ross hesitated for a fraction of a second. We're in the process of interviewing the gala attendees. So no, you don't have witnesses right now, Mr. Pierce. Call your first witness. The business partner testified first, spoke about Madison's withdrawal from social functions, her paranoid questions about Derek's work, her obsessive behavior regarding his schedule, made her sound unstable, controlling, jealous. The executive assistant came next, recounted the wine spill, claimed Madison had been confrontational and aggressive before it happened, suggested Madison might have caused the fall deliberately to frame Derek. That testimony made Madison's stomach turn. They were painting her as not just unstable, but calculating, dangerous. The event planner sealed it, testified that Madison had been drinking despite her pregnancy, that she'd stumbled multiple times before the fall, that Derek had been trying to help her when she lashed out and lost her balance. All lies, all perfectly coordinated lies. Ms. Ross, do you have witnesses to contradict this testimony? Judge Morrison asked. Ross called the hotel manager who'd seen the aftermath, but he could only testify to what happened after Madison fell, not before. The judge looked unimpressed. Your Honor, Ross said, we have evidence of financial crimes that Mr. Kavanaugh is currently under FBI investigation for. This custody grab is his attempt to silence his wife before she can testify against him. Pierce objected immediately. Speculation and irrelevant to this hearing. My client has not been charged with any crimes. Ms. Ross is throwing mud, hoping something sticks. Sustained, Morrison said. Ms. Ross, stick to the facts relevant to custody. The hearing dragged on for 2 hours. Madison watched her life being dissected, rewritten, weaponized against her. Every choice she'd made under Derek's control was now evidence of her instability. Every moment of isolation he'd forced on her became proof she was paranoid and antisocial. Finally, Judge Morrison called a recess. I'll have my decision in 30 minutes. In a small waiting room, Ross turned to Madison. I'm sorry, he's not listening. He's going to give Derek custody, Madison said. It wasn't a question. Temporary custody? Yes, probably until you undergo psychiatric evaluation, which Derek will control, which Derek will try to control. But Madison, listen to me, this isn't over. Paige Sullivan is working on something. She wouldn't tell me what, but she said to stall as long as possible. Harrison's phone rang. He stepped into the hallway to answer, then came back white-faced. That was my security team. Derek's people just tried to access the safety deposit box. First National Bank. They had a court order. Sarah's journal, Madison breathed. The bank manager called me because the box is under your maiden name, which means legally I'm still the authorized party. I told them to deny access until we could get there. Too late, a voice said from the doorway. Derek stood there, holding a burned leather journal. Looking for this, my people are very thorough. Madison, you should have hidden it better. He tossed the journal on the table. The pages were ash, barely holding together. Whatever Sarah Kavanaugh had written was gone. Destroyed. You bastard, Harrison growled. Careful, Mr. Brooks. That sounds like a threat. Derek smiled. The judge is ready to give his decision. Shall we? Back in the conference room, Judge Morrison looked uncomfortable but resolute. I've made my decision. Given the testimony and evidence presented, I'm granting temporary emergency custody of the unborn child to Derek Kavanaugh, effective upon birth. Mrs. Kavanaugh will undergo a 72-hour psychiatric evaluation at Riverside Mental Health Facility. Depending on the results, we'll reconvene to discuss long-term custody arrangements. Madison felt the words like physical blows. You're taking my baby. No one's taking anything, Morrison said. We're ensuring your child's safety while you get help. Help, Madison repeated numbly. Riverside Mental Health Facility. Derek's company had just donated $2 million to their new wing. She'd seen the press release last month. Derek stood, his expression perfectly calibrated sympathy. Madison, please, let me help you. This doesn't have to be a fight. Something in Madison snapped. All the fear, all the careful survival tactics, all the years of swallowing her voice, shattered. No, she said. Everyone turned to look at her. No, she said again, stronger. I won't do the evaluation. I won't give you my baby. I won't play along with this anymore. Mrs. Kavanaugh, Judge Morrison warned, you don't have a choice. Actually, she does, a new voice said. A woman walked into the conference room, FBI badge held high. Behind her came Paige Sullivan and 2 other agents. I'm Special Agent Rebecca Ward, FBI Financial Crimes Division. Derek Kavanaugh, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and theft of pension funds totaling $470 million. The room exploded into chaos. Derek's face went white, then red. This is harassment. I'll sue the entire bureau. You do that. Agent Ward said. She nodded to Paige, who stepped forward, holding a flash drive. We have everything, Paige said, looking directly at Madison. Your recording, Derek didn't destroy them. He uploaded them to a cloud server, thinking he'd erase the originals. But digital evidence never really disappears. We recovered all 6 months. Every conversation, every threat, every admission of abuse. She turned to Judge Morrison. Your Honor, I think you'll want to reconsider that custody decision. Derek lunged for Paige. Harrison intercepted him, and suddenly the small conference room was full of FBI agents restraining a billionaire who'd finally lost control of his perfect narrative. Madison watched it all, her hand on her belly, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of joy, not yet. Tears of exhaustion, of 3 years of survival, finally ending. Mrs. Kavanaugh, Agent Ward said gently, we need you to come to our office, give a full statement. It's going to be a long night. Madison nodded. She stood, her father supporting her arm, and walked out of the courthouse. Behind her, Derek was still screaming about his lawyers, his connections, his rights. But Madison didn't look back. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't have to. The FBI field office smelled like coffee and printer toner. Madison sat in an interview room, a blanket around her shoulders despite the building's efficient heating. Across from her, Agent Ward set up a recording device while Paige hovered nearby with a laptop. Before we start, Ward said, you should know this interview is voluntary. You have the right to an attorney present. Camille Ross is on her way, Madison said. But I don't want to wait. I want to tell you everything while it's fresh, while I still have the courage. Ward nodded and pressed record. This is Special Agent Rebecca Ward, December 15th, interviewing Madison Brooks Kavanaugh regarding case number 7743 financial fraud and domestic violence investigation. Mrs. Kavanaugh, can you state your full name and relationship to the subject? And Madison talked. She started with the beginning, 3 years ago, when Derek Kavanaugh had walked into the coffee shop where she'd been editing an article. How charming he'd been, how interested in her work, how quickly the relationship had escalated. He love-bombed me, Madison said, using the term she'd learned from her mother, the therapist. Flowers every day, expensive gifts, constant attention. I thought it was romantic. I didn't realize he was studying me, learning my weaknesses. The engagement had been fast, the wedding faster. And then, slowly, the isolation began. First, he suggested I take a break from journalism, said I was working too hard, stressing myself out. Then he started questioning my friendships. Why was I going out with college friends when I had him? Didn't I want to spend time together? He made me feel guilty for having a life outside our marriage. Paige pulled up bank records on her laptop. Can you identify these accounts? Madison looked at the screen. Her name was on several accounts, but she'd never opened them. I don't recognize these. Your signature is on the paperwork, but look at the dates. Madison studied them. They'd been opened during her honeymoon, when she'd been in Bali with Derek, when she'd signed dozens of documents he'd said were just routine financial planning. He forged my signature, Madison asked. Technically, you signed them, Ward said, but you didn't know what you were signing. These accounts were used to launder money from the pension fund theft. Your name made them look legitimate. The implications hit Madison like a freight train. He was framing me from the beginning. If any of this came out, I'd be the one holding the bag. Exactly, Dom, Paige said. This is how he operates. Uses people close to him as shields. His first wife, Sarah, same pattern. Her name was on accounts too. Tell me about Sarah, Ward prompted. Madison recounted finding the journal, the storage unit Derek thought he'd cleared out. She wrote about how he'd escalate, start with criticism, move to isolation, then control. By the end, she was terrified. The last entry said she'd found evidence of his financial crimes and was going to the police. And 2 days later, she was dead, Ward said. Ruled a suicide, single gunshot wound, no note. You think Derek killed her. We're reopening that investigation. The journal was destroyed, but you gave a detailed account of its contents. Combined with the pattern we're seeing with you, it's enough to warrant a new look. For hours, Madison answered questions, about the abuse, about the finances she'd unknowingly signed, about Derek's business associates. She showed them the bruises still fading on her arms, told them about the times he'd hurt her where no one could see. The recordings Paige mentioned, Madison said. Can I hear them? Ward glanced at Paige, who nodded. She pulled up an audio file. Madison's own voice filled the room, tinny through the computer speakers. Derek, please, I'm trying to make dinner. I didn't mean to burn the chicken. Derek's voice, cold and controlled. You're pathetic. Can't even handle basic tasks. This is why I have to monitor everything you do. You're incompetent without me. I'm sorry, and I'll do better. You always say that, but you never change. Maybe the problem is you're just stupid. Madison. Did you ever think of that you're not smart enough to function as an adult? Madison listened to herself apologize, heard the tremor in her voice, the defeated tone of someone who'd stopped believing in her own worth. Turn it off, she whispered. Paige stopped the playback. There are 100 more conversations like that, all documented, all showing a clear pattern of psychological abuse. Why did I stay? Madison asked, though she was really asking herself. I was a journalist. I investigated powerful people. I wasn't weak. So why did I stay? Because leaving an abuser isn't about strength, Ward said quietly. It's about resources, opportunity, and survival. He systematically removed your resources. He monitored your opportunities. And he convinced you that survival meant compliance. You did what you had to do to stay alive. Mrs. Kavanaugh, that's not weakness, that's strategy. When Camille Ross arrived, she brought news. Judge Morrison has rescinded the custody order, issued a formal apology, which I'm sure has nothing to do with the ethics complaint I'm filing against him tomorrow. Derek's been denied bail. He's currently in federal custody, and the prosecutor is adding charges of witness tampering and destruction of evidence. What about the psychiatric evaluation? Madison asked. Canceled. You won't be forced into any evaluation, though I'd recommend you see a therapist of your own choosing, not for legal reasons. For you. Madison nodded. The baby kicked, a strong flutter that made her gasp. She put her hand on her belly, feeling the life that had survived despite everything. There's one more thing, Paige said. She looked nervous. Madison, when we were recovering the deleted files from Derek's cloud server, we found something else. Videos. Madison's blood ran cold. What kind of videos? Surveillance. He had cameras hidden throughout your penthouse, bedroom, bathroom, everywhere. He was watching you constantly. The violation of it hit Madison like a physical blow. Every private moment, every time she'd thought she was alone, he'd been watching, documenting, controlling even her illusion of privacy. How long? Madison whispered. 3 years, from the day you moved in. Madison stood abruptly, stumbled to the corner of the interview room, and threw up into a wastebasket. Beth, who'd been waiting outside, rushed in and held her daughter's hair back. He watched me, Madison said between heaves. The whole time, he watched me. I know, sweetheart. I know. When the immediate shock passed, Madison straightened, wiped her mouth, looked at Agent Ward with something new in her eyes. I want to testify, she said, against Derek. At trial, I want to stand up in open court and tell everyone what he did, not just to me, to Sarah, to all the families whose pension funds he stole. I want to look him in the eye and take back every piece of myself he tried to destroy. Ward smiled. We were hoping you'd say that. But first, Madison said, I need to have a baby. As if on cue, a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen. Madison gasped, her hand flying to her belly. Oh no. Mrs. Kavanaugh, Ward stood. The baby, Madison said. Something's wrong. It's too early. I'm only 34 weeks. Another contraction hit. Harder. Madison's legs buckled. Harrison caught her before she hit the floor. Call an ambulance, Beth shouted. But Madison knew, with the certainty of a mother's instinct, that there was no time. Her baby was coming now. And after everything they'd both survived, Madison prayed they'd both make it through one more fight. The ambulance ride to Cedars-Sinai was a blur of sirens and pain. Madison gripped her mother's hand while paramedics monitored the baby's heartbeat. Too fast. The baby was in distress. Stay with me, Madison whispered to her belly. Just a little longer. We're almost there. At the hospital, Dr. Palmer was waiting. Emergency C-section, she said immediately after examining the Madison. The baby's showing signs of fetal distress. We can't wait. Is he going to be okay? Madison asked as they wheeled her towards surgery. We're going to do everything we can, Palmer said, which wasn't a yes, but wasn't a no. The operating room was bright and cold. Madison shivered under the thin gown, her lower body going numb as they administered the epidural. Beth stood beside her head, masked and gowned, holding her hand. I'm scared, Madison whispered. I know, Beth said, but you're the bravest person I've ever known. You survived Derek. You can survive this. The surgery was quick and surreal. Madison felt tugging, pressure, but no pain. Then suddenly a thin cry cut through the sterile air. It's a boy, Dr. Palmer announced. 5 pounds, 3 ounces. Is he okay? Madison tried to sit up, but the surgical drape blocked her view. Breathing on his own. APGAR score is 7. Not bad for 34 weeks. Palmer's voice was cautiously optimistic. He'll need to spend some time in the NICU, but I think he's going to be just fine. They brought him over, a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. Madison saw a wrinkled red face, eyes squeezed shut, fists waving in indignation at being born. Hi, baby, she whispered. I'm your mom. I'm so sorry for everything you've already been through. But I promise, the hard part is over. The baby stopped crying, as if listening to her voice. Madison felt something break open in her chest, a fierce protective love so overwhelming it hurt. Jamie, she said. His name is Jamie Harrison Brooks. Not Kavanaugh. Brooks. Beth was crying behind her mask. It's perfect. They took Jamie to the NICU, where he'd stay for at least 2 weeks to gain weight and strength. Madison was moved to recovery, where she drifted in and out of consciousness, the anesthesia pulling her under. When she fully woke, Harrison was sitting beside her bed. He looked older somehow, the stress of the past few days etched into his face. He's beautiful, Harrison said. Looks just like you did as a baby. Have you seen him, spent an hour in the NICU. He's a fighter. Maddie, just like his mom. Madison closed her eyes. I can't believe it's over. It's not over, Harrison said gently. Derek's trial will take months. The media attention is going to be intense. You'll have to testify, relive everything. That's not going to be easy. I know, but I'm not alone anymore. Madison opened her eyes. Dad, I'm sorry for pushing you away, for not listening when you warned me about Derek. You were right. No, Harrison said firmly. I wasn't right. I handled it wrong. I gave you an ultimatum when I should have given you support. I let my pride keep me from my daughter for 3 years. That's on me, not you. Can we just agree we both made mistakes and move forward? Harrison smiled. Deal. Over the next 2 weeks, Madison's life found a new rhythm. Days spent in the NICU with Jamie, watching him grow stronger. Nights spent with therapists, working through the trauma Derek had inflicted. Her parents rented an apartment near the hospital, refusing to leave her side. Paige visited regularly, updating Madison on the case. Derek's business empire was collapsing. His investors were fleeing. His associates were cutting deals, testifying against him to save themselves. And Sloan Hartley, Madison asked, cooperating fully. Turns out Derek was setting her up the same way he set up you and Sarah. Once she realized that, she turned on him fast. She's got her own story about his manipulation. Camille Ross was building an airtight case: financial fraud, domestic violence, witness tampering. Each charge carried significant prison time. Realistically, Ross told Madison during one hospital visit, we're looking at 25 to 30 years. With his money and connections, he'll appeal everything, but he's going to prison. That much is certain. On Madison's last day in the hospital before discharge, Dr. Palmer came by with Jamie's final checkup results. He's cleared to go home. 5 pounds, 8 ounces, healthy as can be expected for a preemie. You did good, Mom. Madison held her son, marveling at how much he'd grown in just 2 weeks. He looked up at her with dark blue eyes that would probably turn brown like hers, his tiny hand wrapped around her finger. We're going home, she whispered to him. Not to the penthouse. Never back there. Your grandparents found us a place. Small but safe. Just you and me, figuring this out together. Beth appeared in the doorway. Ready. Madison looked around the hospital room that had been her refuge in prison at various times over the past weeks. At the window where she'd watched snowfall and wondered if she'd survive. At the bed where she'd nearly lost everything. Yeah, she said. I'm ready. The drive to her new apartment took them through downtown Los Angeles. Past the courthouse where Derek was being held, Madison looked up at the building and felt nothing. No fear, no anger, just a sense of finality. The apartment was in Pasadena, a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a small kitchen. Nothing like the penthouse luxury she'd lived in with Derek, but it felt more like home than anywhere she'd been in 3 years. That night, after Jamie was asleep in his bassinet and her parents had left for their own apartment, Madison stood at the window looking out at the city lights. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 years ago, ambitious, fearless, certain of her place in the world. Then she thought about the woman she'd become, careful, controlled, nearly broken. And finally, she thought about who she was now, a survivor, a mother, someone who'd walked through fire and emerged scarred, but standing. Her phone buzzed. A text from Paige. Derek's attorney just filed a motion to dismiss all charges. It's going to be denied, but be prepared for him to fight every step. You still okay testifying? Madison looked at her sleeping son, thought about Sarah Kavanaugh, about all the women Derek had hurt. She typed back, I'll be there. Tell Ross I'm ready whenever she needs me. Outside, the city hummed with life. Somewhere, Derek Kavanaugh sat in a cell, probably plotting his legal strategy, convinced his money and connections would save him. But Madison knew something he didn't. The truth, once spoken, can't be unheard. And she was ready to speak it as loudly as necessary. 6 months later, Madison stood in front of her bathroom mirror again, but this time she wasn't hiding bruises. She was preparing to face Derek Kavanaugh one final time. The trial had begun 3 days ago. The prosecution had presented their financial evidence first, mind-numbing spreadsheets in bank records that painted Derek as a thief who'd stolen from working families. Then came the domestic violence charges, where Sloan Hartley had testified about the psychological manipulation she'd endured. Today was Madison's turn. She dressed carefully in a navy suit Ross had helped her choose. Professional but not expensive. Credible but not showy. Jamie was with her parents, safe and growing. 4 months old now, with chubby cheeks and her smile. At the courthouse, media vans lined the street. This had become the trial of the year, billionaire abuser versus brave survivor. Madison hated the narrative, the way they'd turned her trauma into entertainment, but she understood it was necessary. Public attention meant Derek couldn't make this disappear. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Madison took the witness stand, her hands steady as she swore to tell the truth. Camille Ross approached with a gentle smile. Mrs. Brooks, can you state your relationship to the defendant? I was married to Derek Kavanaugh for 3 years. And during that marriage, did Mr. Kavanaugh ever physically harm you? Yes. Madison looked directly at Derek, who sat at the defense table in a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Multiple times. For the next 2 hours, Madison testified. She described the isolation, the control, the escalating violence. She talked about the night at the Christmas gala, the kick that had sent her to the hospital, the baby who'd nearly died. Derek's attorney, Gerald Pierce, tried to shake her on cross-examination. Mrs. Brooks, isn't it true you have a history of mental health issues? I have PTSD from being abused by your client. Yes. And isn't it possible that your memories of events are colored by this diagnosis? No, I have recordings, video evidence, medical records, witnesses. My memories aren't colored. They're documented. Pierce tried again. You've admitted to hiding evidence, lying to your husband, secretly recording conversations. Doesn't that suggest deceptive behavior? Madison paused, then smiled slightly. You're right, I did all those things because I was documenting crimes and trying to survive. Victims shouldn't have to be perfect to be believed. Mr. Pierce, the courtroom murmured approval. Judge Morrison, who'd been replaced by a different judge after his ethics violation, nodded. When Madison stepped down, She felt lighter. She'd said everything she needed to say. Now it was up to the jury. The trial lasted 2 more weeks. Additional witnesses testified about Derek's business practices, his pattern of manipulation, his threats against anyone who opposed him. Page presented her forensic accounting evidence, showing in meticulous detail how Derek had stolen $470 million over 5 years. Finally, the jury deliberated. Madison waited at her apartment, Jamie in her arms, watching the news coverage. Beth made tea, nobody drank. Harrison paced. "What if they don't convict?" Madison asked. "They will," Ross said with certainty. She'd join them for the wait. "The evidence is overwhelming." 4 hours later, Madison's phone rang. "We have a verdict," Ross said. "We need to get to the courthouse." The courtroom was silent as the jury foreman stood. "In the case of the people versus Derek Kavanaugh, on the charge of wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of theft of pension funds, we find the defendant guilty." The charges continued, each one punctuated by the word guilty. When they reached the assault charges, Madison held her breath. "On the charge of assault with great bodily injury, we find the defendant guilty." Derek's face remained impassive, but his hands clenched white on the table. "On the charge of attempted murder," Madison gasped. "They'd added attempted murder. We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom exploded. Derek's attorneys immediately filed for appeal. Media rushed for the exits to file their stories. Madison simply sat, tears streaming down her face. Judge Morrison's replacement called for order. "Mr. Kavanaugh, you will be remanded to custody pending sentencing. Sentencing hearing is set for 30 days from now." As deputies led Derek away in handcuffs, he looked back at Madison once. She met his eyes steadily, unafraid. He was the one who looked away first. Outside, reporters swarmed. Madison made a brief statement Ross had helped her prepare. "I want to thank the FBI, particularly Agent Ward and forensic accountant Paige Sullivan, for their tireless work. I want to thank Prosecutor Camille Ross for fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself. And I want to say to anyone experiencing abuse, you're not alone. You're not crazy. You're not imagining it. And when you're ready, there are people who will believe you and help you." She paused, looking directly at the cameras. "I also want to announce that I'm launching the Brooks Foundation for Domestic Violence Survivors. We'll provide legal aid, counseling, and safe housing for people escaping abuse, because everyone deserves to feel safe in their own home." The questions came fast after that, but Ross ushered Madison away to a waiting car. At the sentencing hearing 1 month later, Derek received 28 years in federal prison. With credit for time served in good behavior, he'd be eligible for parole in 23 years. By then, Madison would be 51, Jamie would be 23. "It's not enough," Beth said quietly. "No, Madison agreed. "But it's something." 1 year after the trial, Madison stood on a stage at the grand opening of the Brooks Foundation headquarters, a modern building with glass walls and blue ribbons. It stood in downtown Los Angeles as a beacon for survivors. Jamie was on her hip, bigger now and starting to babble. He wore a tiny suit that made him look like a miniature executive. When he saw the crowd, he waved enthusiastically, making everyone laugh. "A year ago," Madison said into the microphone, "I was in the hospital, fighting for my life and my son's life. I thought I'd lost everything, but what I actually lost was the prison I'd been living in, and what I gained was freedom." She looked out at the audience, survivors of abuse, donors, supporters, her family. "This foundation exists because no one should have to face what I faced alone, because safety shouldn't be a luxury, because we deserve better than silence and fear." After the ceremony, Madison walked through the foundation's offices, legal aid on the first floor, counseling rooms on the second, emergency housing intake on the third. Everything survivors might need in one place. "You built something incredible," Paige said, appearing beside her. "We built it," Madison corrected. "None of this happens without you." That evening, Madison sat in her apartment with Jamie, reading him a board book about trucks. He was more interested in eating the pages, but she persevered. This was their routine now. Bath time, story time, bedtime. Simple and safe in theirs. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "I saw your foundation announcement. I'm a survivor too." Thank you for giving me hope. Madison had received hundreds of these messages over the past year. Each one reminded her why the hard parts had been worth it. She looked around her small apartment, at the photos on the wall, her parents, Jamie, even one of herself from before Derek, young and confident and whole, at the laptop on the table where she'd started writing again, chronicling not just her story but the stories of other survivors, at the bassinet where Jamie now slept, peaceful and safe. This wasn't the life she'd imagined 3 years ago. It was smaller in some ways, harder in others, but it was hers, completely, authentically hers. And for the first time since she could remember, Madison Brooks was exactly who she wanted to be. Outside, the Los Angeles night glittered with possibility. Tomorrow she'd testify at Derek's appeal hearing. Next week she'd interview for a journalism position at a magazine focused on women's rights. Next month she'd open the foundation's second location. But tonight she was just a mother watching her son sleep, grateful for every breath, every moment, every second chance she'd fought so hard to earn. The perfect prison was gone, and in its place stood a life worth living.